Amanda gripped the steering wheel as pain tore through her body, alone on a desert highway with no signal and no one for miles. Then she heard it, the sound she'd feared her entire life. Engines, dozens of them growing louder, closer, surrounding her car before she could even think to run. 150 bikers, leather vests and cold stares, the exact danger she'd spent years avoiding. But when one man knelt beside her window and asked if she was all right, Amanda whispered 4 words that would change everything. What happened next on that empty stretch of road would shatter everything she thought she knew about the people she'd always been taught to fear. Amanda Cole had learned not to expect help from anyone. At 27, 8 months pregnant and working double shifts at the Sunrise Diner off Route 60, she had built her life around a simple rule: rely only on yourself, because everyone else eventually leaves. The diner sat on the edge of a small Arizona town called Redwater, a place with 1 gas station, 1 church, and more tumbleweeds than people. Amanda had moved there 4 months earlier after the father of her baby, a man named Dennis, packed a duffel bag one night and drove off in his truck without so much as a note. She had found out she was pregnant 3 weeks before that. She never told him. There didn't seem to be a point. Her mother had died when she was 19. Her father was somewhere in Nevada, remarried, uninterested. She had a sister in Ohio they hadn't spoken to in years, not after an argument that neither of them could fully explain anymore. So when Dennis left, there was no family to call, no friend group to lean on. Just Amanda, a rented room above the diner, and a baby that was coming whether she was ready or not. She worked until her feet swelled and her back screamed, because the tips from truckers passing through were the only thing standing between her and losing the room. The owner of the diner, an older woman named Patricia, was kind enough, but kindness didn't pay hospital bills. Amanda had a plan, thin as it was: save enough for gas money and a motel near the hospital in Prescott, drive there when the contractions started, deliver the baby, and figure out the rest later. She didn't have insurance. She didn't have a birth plan. She had a duffel bag packed by the door and a phone with a cracked screen and 40% battery on a good day. What she did have was fear, a specific, well-worn kind of fear that came from being a woman alone on desert highways. And nothing frightened her more than the sound of motorcycles. 6 years earlier, before she'd ever set foot in Arizona, Amanda had been 16 and stranded at a gas station in New Mexico with her mother, whose car had broken down at dusk. A group of bikers had pulled in, loud and rough-looking, leather vests covered in patches, and her mother had gripped her hand so tight it left marks. Nothing happened. The bikers bought gas and left. But the fear had lodged itself somewhere permanent in Amanda's chest, and every roar of an engine on the highway since had sent her heart into her throat. She had grown up on stories, some true, most exaggerated, about biker gangs and violence, about towns terrorized by clubs with skull patches and outlaw reputations. She didn't know the difference between a weekend rider and a one-percenter, and she'd never bothered to learn. To Amanda, they were all the same: danger on 2 wheels. So when a line of motorcycles thundered past the diner most Friday evenings, headed toward a clubhouse 20 miles out that everyone in Redwater called Iron Wolves territory, Amanda made sure she was inside, doors locked, lights low, until the sound faded into the desert dark. Patricia had tried to correct her once. "They tip better than anyone who comes through that door," she'd said, wiping down the counter after a group of them had left a stack of 20s under a coffee mug. "Frank Sullivan's boys picked up my whole parking lot after that windstorm last spring. Nobody asked them to." Amanda had nodded politely and said nothing. She didn't believe it, not really. People could do one kind thing and still be dangerous. That was what she told herself anyway, the same way she told herself that Dennis leaving was a blessing, that she didn't need anybody, that she'd get through this alone because she always had. Some nights, lying awake in the small room above the diner with her hand pressed to her swollen belly, Amanda let herself imagine what it might be like to have someone in the next room, someone who would hear her if she called out. She never let the thought linger long, wanting things she couldn't have felt like a wasted kind of pain, and she had enough of the necessary kind already. Better to plan, to save, to keep moving forward on her own terms than to wish for a version of her life that didn't exist. She kept a small spiral notebook in her purse, where she'd written out a checklist for the birth. Hospital bag items, phone numbers for the 2 people in Redwater she trusted enough to call if something went wrong. Directions to Prescott Regional Medical Center written out by hand in case her phone died. It was a thin, makeshift safety net, built entirely by herself, and she'd told herself for months that it would be enough. 3 days before her due date, Amanda's water broke on a Tuesday afternoon while she was 31 miles from Redwater and 44 miles from the nearest hospital, driving her 14-year-old sedan down a stretch of Route 60 that had no cell towers, no gas stations, and no other cars in sight. She had been on her way to pick up a used crib from a woman in the next county, one last errand before she planned to stop working and wait out the final days. The contraction that came with the gush of warm liquid down her legs was unlike anything she had prepared for in the pamphlets she'd read. It doubled her over the steering wheel, and for a moment the car drifted onto the gravel shoulder before she managed to stop it. She sat there, hands shaking, the desert stretching flat and endless in every direction, heat shimmering off the asphalt, and reached for her phone. No signal, not one bar. She tried anyway, dialing 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling, and got nothing but a dead, hollow silence. Another contraction hit, sharper than the first, and Amanda understood with a cold, sinking certainty that she was utterly alone on a highway in the middle of nowhere. And her baby was coming. For 20 minutes, Amanda sat in the driver's seat, timing contractions with the clock on her dashboard because her phone was useless. 6 minutes apart, then 5. The pain was a living thing now, gripping her lower back and radiating forward, and between waves, she pressed her forehead to the steering wheel and tried to breathe the way she'd read about, in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, though nothing about it felt like it was working. The heat inside the car climbed steadily, the afternoon sun pressing through the windshield until sweat soaked through her waitress uniform. She rolled the windows down an inch, just enough to let in air that smelled of hot asphalt and creosote bush, and listened to the silence stretch out around her, broken only by the occasional distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the scrubland. There was no shade for miles, no shoulder wide enough to feel safe, just the flat, merciless stretch of highway, and the growing certainty that whatever happened next would happen without anyone's help but her own. She thought about calling out, though there was no one to hear her. She thought about the birth classes she'd read about online, but never attended, too expensive, too far from Redwater, and wondered whether any of it would have prepared her for this. For the specific, isolating terror of feeling her body begin the most important process of her life in a place where a scream would simply vanish into empty desert air. She thought about walking. 44 miles to the hospital was impossible, but maybe there was a ranch nearby, a farmhouse, something. She opened the car door and immediately saw nothing but scrub brush and heat haze in every direction. No structures, no dust trails from other vehicles, just the 2-lane highway disappearing into shimmering nothing on both horizons. Amanda climbed back into the car and started to cry, quietly at first, then in the kind of ragged, gasping sobs that came from more than just the pain. She cried for the mother who wasn't there to tell her what to do. She cried for Dennis, not because she missed him, but because even his absence would have been better than complete solitude. She cried because she had spent months telling herself she didn't need anyone, and now, alone on a highway with contractions 4 minutes apart, she understood how wrong she had been. That was when she heard it, the sound she had spent years flinching away from. Engines. Dozens of them, maybe more, a low rolling thunder building from the east, growing louder with every second. Her first instinct was pure animal panic. She fumbled to lock the car doors, sliding down in her seat as if she could somehow disappear. Through the windshield, she watched the horizon resolve into shapes. Motorcycle after motorcycle after motorcycle, an unbroken line stretching back so far she couldn't see where it ended. Leather vests and chrome catching the harsh desert sun. Patches on their backs she was too far away to read. They were slowing down. Amanda's heart hammered against her ribs as the lead riders spotted her car on the shoulder and began pulling over, engines cutting off one by one until the silence afterward felt almost louder than the noise had been. Dozens of men and women dismounted, and for one terrified moment, Amanda was certain this was exactly the danger she had always believed bikers represented. A highway robbery, or worse, happening to her at the worst possible moment of her life. She watched them through the windshield, counting without meaning to, 10, 20, 30. The line of motorcycles seeming to stretch endlessly back toward the horizon, chrome and black leather shimmering in the heat. Patches on their vests caught the light. Iron Wolves MC, stitched in bold letters above smaller patches she didn't recognize, pins and insignia that meant nothing to her except confirmation of every warning she'd ever absorbed about clubs like this one. Her hands found the door lock out of pure instinct, and she slid down as low as her pregnant belly would allow, as if she could fold herself small enough to disappear from view entirely. But nobody approached with menace. Nobody shouted or pounded on her car. Instead, she saw them fanning out along the shoulder with a kind of practiced order, some walking toward the front of the line, others simply standing beside their bikes, scanning the highway in both directions as though watching for something, or someone. A man approached her window first. He was older, maybe mid-50s, grey beard, a weathered face, and a leather vest covered in patches that read Iron Wolves MC, and beneath that, President. His expression wasn't threatening. It was concerned, direct, the way a person looks at someone they can tell is in trouble. He moved without hurry, but without hesitation either, the walk of someone accustomed to assessing a situation quickly and acting on what he found. Behind him, other riders were beginning to notice the stopped car too, heads turning, conversations quieting as word passed backward along the line. Amanda felt the weight of 150 strangers' attention shifting toward her small, stranded sedan, and her panic spiked even higher, some part of her mind insisting that this much attention could only mean danger, even as another part of her, quieter and more desperate, understood she had no other option but to find out. He tapped gently on the glass. "Ma'am, you all right in there?" Amanda didn't move. Another contraction seized her, and this time the pain was strong enough that she couldn't hold back a cry, hunching forward over the wheel, her hands white-knuckled on the door handle. The man's face changed instantly, concern sharpening into urgency. "Roy, get over here!" he called over his shoulder, and a younger biker jogged up beside him, tattoos climbing his forearms, a bandana tied over dark hair. Amanda, through the haze of pain and fear, found herself rolling the window down half an inch, some instinct overriding the terror. "My water just broke," she whispered, barely audible, ashamed of how weak her voice sounded. "I have nobody. There's no signal. I don't know what to do." The grey-bearded man's expression didn't hold a trace of judgment or hesitation. "Okay," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle. "My name's Frank. This is Roy. Nobody's gonna hurt you. We're gonna get you help, all right? Can you open the door for me?" Amanda hesitated. Every part of her upbringing, every story she'd absorbed, every flinch response built over years, told her not to trust this. But another contraction hit, worse than the last, and beneath the fear was something more urgent. Her baby was coming, and she had no other option in the world but the one currently standing outside her window. Her hand shook as she reached for the lock. The moment the door opened, the bikers moved with a coordination that startled Amanda more than anything else could have. Frank Sullivan crouched beside her, keeping his voice low and even. Roy Bennett was already jogging back down the line of parked motorcycles, shouting something Amanda couldn't make out. Within a minute, an older man with silver hair and a calm, clinical manner knelt on her other side. Amanda registered details in fragments, the way people do when panic narrows the world down to only what matters. The warmth of Frank's hand hovering near her shoulder, not touching, just present. The dust on Roy's boots as he crouched by the open door. The low murmur of voices up and down the line of parked bikes, dozens of conversations happening at once as word spread backward through the group. A woman, pregnant, alone, no signal, no ambulance close enough. She had expected chaos from 150 strangers converging on one small emergency. What she got instead was something closer to a machine clicking into gear, each person finding a role without needing to be told twice. "This is Walter," Frank said. "Used to be a paramedic before he retired. He's going to check on you and the baby, that all right?" Amanda nodded, unable to speak through the next contraction. Walter Higgins took her wrist gently, checking her pulse, asking questions in a measured tone that cut through her panic. How far apart the contractions were, how long she'd been in labor, whether this was her first pregnancy, whether she had any complications the hospital should know about. His hands were steady, his manner unhurried despite the chaos gathering around them, and something in Amanda's chest loosened slightly, just enough to let her answer. 4 minutes apart, she managed. First baby. No complications, I don't think. I don't have insurance. I don't have... Her voice cracked. "None of that matters right now," Walter said firmly. "Right now, we're just getting you and this baby somewhere safe." Amanda watched, disoriented, as the scene around her transformed. Bikers who moments earlier had seemed like an approaching storm were now organizing with military precision. Someone pulled a first aid kit the size of a suitcase from a saddlebag. Someone else was flagging down the rare passing vehicle, waving reflective vests. Frank had his phone out, walking a few feet away, speaking urgently into it. A woman Amanda hadn't noticed before draped a leather jacket over the open car door, creating a small patch of shade against the relentless sun, and someone else produced a bottle of cold water from a cooler strapped to the back of a motorcycle, holding it to Amanda's lips between contractions. None of it felt rehearsed exactly, but it also didn't feel improvised. It felt like people who had learned, through years of riding together, how to take care of each other in moments that mattered, and who had simply extended that same instinct to a stranger without a second thought. "He's trying to get a signal by climbing that ridge," Roy explained, crouching near her window again. "Cell service is dead down here, but sometimes you catch a bar or two up higher." Amanda's contraction eased enough for her to ask the question that had been building since the moment she saw them. "Why are you helping me?" Roy looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if it hadn't occurred to him that help would need justifying. "Because you're stuck on the side of the road having a baby, with nobody around for 40 miles, he said simply. "What else would we do?" "You didn't answer me," Roy said gently, still crouched near her window, his tone free of any judgment. "Why are we the ones who scare you?" Amanda hesitated, ashamed of the honest answer. "I was a kid. Saw a group like this at a gas station once. My mom was scared, so I got scared too. Never really thought about it since. Just assumed." Roy nodded slowly, not offended, seeming to understand something about how fear got passed down without anyone meaning for it to happen. "Lot of people assume," he said. "We don't take it personal, long as folks come around eventually." Before Amanda could respond further, Walter's voice sharpened with new urgency. "Frank, contractions are 3 minutes apart now. We don't have time to wait on a signal." Frank jogged back, phone still raised, frustration creasing his face. "One bar. I got a text out to the county sheriff's office, but I don't know if it went through. Nearest hospital's 44 miles. And even if an ambulance is coming, it's gonna take them the better part of an hour to reach us out here." Amanda felt a fresh wave of terror rise, sharper than any contraction. 44 miles, an hour. She didn't know if she had an hour. It was Walter who spoke next, his voice cutting through the rising panic with the calm authority of someone who had seen emergencies before. "We don't wait for the ambulance to come to us. We meet it halfway. We create our own corridor." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then turned and raised his voice so it carried down the full length of the parked motorcycles. Over 150 riders now gathered along the shoulder of the highway, waiting. "We're escorting her in," he shouted. "Clear a path, full formation. We ride until we hit that ambulance or we hit that hospital ourselves. Nobody stops till she's safe. Walter, you're with her in the car. Roy, front position. Let's move." The response was immediate. Engines roared back to life in a wave down the line, and Amanda, caught between another contraction and pure disbelief, watched as more than 100 strangers organized themselves into a moving wall of protection around her single, battered sedan. A convoy she had feared only minutes before, now becoming the only thing standing between her and disaster. Walter climbed into the passenger seat beside her, already talking her through breathing techniques, his hand steady on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "Not for 1 second of this. You understand me." Amanda, gripping the wheel through a wave of pain so intense it blurred her vision, found herself nodding, tears streaking down her face, tears that had nothing left to do with fear. The convoy moved like something out of Amanda's wildest imagination. 150 motorcycles surrounding her car in tight formation. Riders in front clearing oncoming lanes. Riders behind blocking traffic. The collective roar of the engines drowning out even her own labored breathing. Walter sat beside her, one hand bracing against the dashboard, the other holding a small handheld radio Roy had passed him, relaying updates on her contractions to the front of the line. Through the windshield, Amanda watched the desert blur past, in streaks of ochre and dull green, the asphalt shimmering ahead under the relentless afternoon sun. On either side of her car, riders held their formation with a discipline that seemed impossible for a group so large, adjusting speed in perfect unison whenever a contraction forced Amanda to ease off the gas, tightening ranks whenever the road narrowed. She caught glimpses of faces in her side mirrors, weathered, focused, entirely unbothered by the danger of riding so close together at speed. These were people who had clearly done difficult things before, who trusted each other completely, and for the first time, Amanda understood that the discipline she'd once mistaken for menace was actually the opposite, a kind of loyalty so practiced it looked like instinct. 2 minutes apart, Walter said into the radio, voice tight but controlled. "We need that ambulance to be moving toward us, not waiting at the hospital." Static, then Frank's voice crackled back. "Sheriff's dispatch confirmed. Ambulance is en route from Prescott, ETA 18 minutes to intercept point. We'll meet them at the county line." 18 minutes. Amanda did the math in her head, weighing it against contractions now barely 2 minutes apart, and understood without being told that it would be close, closer than anyone in the car wanted to admit out loud. She gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles pale, and forced herself to keep breathing, keep driving, trusting the wall of riders around her to clear whatever stood in the way. Ahead, she could see Roy's motorcycle weaving briefly into the oncoming lane to wave down a produce truck idling at a crossroads, gesturing urgently until the driver understood and pulled well off to the side, giving the convoy a clear corridor through the intersection. It struck Amanda, even through the haze of pain, How effortlessly these strangers moved as a single unit, anticipating obstacles before she even saw them coming, adjusting formation without a single wasted motion. Amanda gripped the wheel through another contraction, the pain now a constant presence rather than a wave that came and went. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead. The desert blurred past the windows, streaked gold and rust in the lowering afternoon sun, and surrounding her on every side were leather vests and chrome, and the steady, thunderous rhythm of engines that had once represented every fear she carried. "Talk to me," Walter said gently, noticing her breathing spiral toward panic. "Tell me about the baby. Boy or girl?" "Girl," Amanda gasped between breaths. I don't have a name yet." "You've got time," Walter said, though the tightness in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that. "What made you decide to do this on your own, if you don't mind me asking?" Amanda almost laughed, a broken, painful sound. "Didn't decide. Just happened. Baby's father left before I even told him. My mom passed a few years back. Guess I got used to not having anybody to lean on." Walter was quiet for a moment, adjusting his grip as the car hit a rough patch of road. "My daughter went through something similar years back," he said finally. "Different circumstances, but she was on her own when she had my grandson. I wasn't there. Wasn't the man I needed to be back then. That's part of why I do this now. Why a lot of us do." He gestured out the window at the wall of riders surrounding them. "Second chances don't always look the way you expect." "What happened?" Amanda asked, then immediately regretted it, unsure if the question crossed a line. But Walter answered anyway, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I was working too much, drinking more than I should have, missed most of the important moments. By the time I figured out what mattered, she'd already stopped waiting on me to show up. Took years to rebuild that, some of it never fully came back." He glanced at Amanda, something gentle in his expression. "So when I see somebody in trouble on the side of the road, pregnant, alone, scared, I don't see a stranger. I see every moment I wasn't there for somebody who needed me. Riding out here, helping however I can, it doesn't erase that. But it matters anyway." Amanda absorbed this in silence, another contraction rolling through her before she could respond. And when it passed, she found herself reaching over to grip Walter's forearm, not out of panic this time, but something closer to gratitude. Before Amanda could respond, a fresh contraction seized her so violently that she cried out, the car swerving slightly before Walter reached over to steady the wheel. "Pull over now," he said firmly into the radio. "She can't keep driving." The convoy responded instantly, riders peeling off ahead to block both lanes as Amanda's car rolled to a stop on the shoulder. Roy was at her door within seconds, and behind him, Frank and a woman Amanda hadn't seen before, wearing a vest like the others, but with a paramedic patch stitched beside her club insignia. "This is Carla," Frank said quickly. "She rides with us, but she's also an EMT over in Prescott. She was 2 bikes back." Carla was already opening the door, assessing Amanda with quick, professional efficiency. "How far apart?" she asked Walter. 90 seconds. Water broke almost an hour ago." Carla's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before smoothing back into calm control. "All right. We might not make the ambulance in time. Amanda, I need you to listen to me. We may need to deliver this baby right here, and if we do, I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Amanda looked around her, at Carla's steady hands, at Walter's grounding presence beside her, at Roy standing guard by the open door, at Frank coordinating the dozens of riders now forming a protective circle around her car, blocking wind and dust and the eyes of the rare passing vehicle, giving her privacy and shelter in the middle of an empty highway. These were the people she had spent years crossing the street to avoid. These were the engines that had sent her heart into her throat every Friday night, and in the moment she needed protection more than she ever had in her life, they had become a wall between her and disaster, without a second of hesitation, without asking for anything in return. "I trust you," Amanda whispered, and meant it completely. In the distance, faint but growing, the wail of an ambulance siren finally cut through the desert air. The ambulance reached them 4 minutes later, cutting through the corridor the bikers had formed down the center of the highway. Carla had already determined there was time to transport, though barely, and the paramedics who took over from her worked with the same calm urgency Amanda had come to recognize in the last desperate hour. As they lifted her into the ambulance, Amanda reached out and grabbed Frank's hand where it rested on the doorframe. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling entirely insufficient for what had just happened. I don't know how to." "You don't have to know how," Frank said, squeezing her hand once before letting go. "We'll follow behind. You're not doing the rest of this alone either." True to his word, when Amanda arrived at Prescott Regional Medical Center 40 minutes later, exhausted and shaking but stable, a portion of the convoy had followed the ambulance the entire way, parking in an orderly line outside the emergency entrance. Walter and Carla came inside with her, staying until hospital staff took over, and Frank waited in the lobby for the 6 hours it took for Amanda's daughter to be born, refusing to leave, despite having never met this stranger before that afternoon. Amanda named her daughter Grace. It felt fitting, though she couldn't fully articulate why, beyond some instinct that the name belonged to a story about mercy arriving from the last place she expected it. In the hours after the delivery, exhausted beyond anything she'd known was possible, Amanda lay in the hospital bed with Grace against her chest and replayed the afternoon in fragments. The sound of engines she'd once feared, Frank's steady voice through the car window, Carla's calm hands, Walter's quiet honesty about his own failures and second chances. None of it matched the story she'd carried in her head for years, the one built from a single frightened memory at a gas station and a lifetime of assumptions she'd never once tested against reality. The days that followed unfolded in ways Amanda never could have predicted. Patricia, her boss at the diner, arrived at the hospital the next morning with a bag of clothes and supplies, having been called by Frank himself, who had somehow tracked down her employer through casual conversation and a shared concern for a woman none of them had known 24 hours earlier. The Iron Wolves, Amanda learned, took up an informal collection among their members, riders from 3 different chapters across the state, people she would never fully meet. And by the end of the week, there was enough money to cover both her hospital bill and 2 months' rent above the diner. Roy visited twice that week, bringing a second-hand crib he'd fixed up himself, sanded and repainted, the kind of quiet gesture that asked for nothing in return. Carla checked on Grace's health personally, using her EMT training to make sure the newborn was thriving. And Walter, the retired paramedic who had ridden beside her through the worst hour of her life, came by most evenings just to sit with her, sharing stories about his daughter and grandson, about the complicated road that had led him to a motorcycle club built on loyalty rather than blood. Even members Amanda had never spoken to directly found small ways to help. A woman named Denise, who Amanda later learned ran the club's charity fundraisers, dropped off a stack of second-hand baby clothes still in good condition, folded neatly in a laundry basket, along with a card that simply read, "Welcome to the family. Iron Wolves." Amanda kept that card for years, tucked into the same spiral notebook where she'd once written out her lonely makeshift birth plan. "We're not what people expect," Walter told her one evening, watching Grace sleep in the hospital bassinet. "Most of us have been through something. Some of us made mistakes we're still making right by. Doesn't mean we can't show up when somebody needs us." Amanda thought often, in the months that followed, about the years she'd spent flinching at the sound of engines, crossing streets, locking doors, carrying a fear she had never once examined closely enough to question. She thought about her mother's grip on her hand at that gas station years ago, about how easily fear could calcify into certainty if nothing ever came along to challenge it. She thought, too, about how close she had come to raising Grace inside that same fear, passing it down the way it had been passed down to her, without ever stopping to ask whether it was true. Instead, she found herself deliberately unlearning it, piece by piece, every visit from Roy or Carla or Walter chipping away at assumptions she'd carried since she was 16 years old. By the time Grace was old enough to reach for things, Amanda had stopped flinching at the sound of engines altogether. She had started listening for them instead, the way you listen for the arrival of people you trust. What had come along in the end was 150 strangers on a highway who owed her nothing and gave her everything anyway. 6 months later, Amanda brought Grace to the Iron Wolves annual charity ride, a fundraiser for the local children's hospital that Frank had been organizing for over a decade, something Amanda had never known existed until she became part of the community that ran it. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching over 100 motorcycles line up for the ride, engines idling, riders laughing and calling to one another, and for the first time in her life, the sound didn't frighten her. It sounded like family. Frank found her near the registration table, Grace bundled against her chest, and smiled the same steady, unhurried smile she remembered from the moment he'd first tapped on her car window. "Look at that," he said, nodding toward the baby. "Never would have guessed the wildest ride of my life would start with a girl whispering through a car window." Amanda laughed, something that had once felt impossible now coming easily. "I judged all of you before I even knew your names," she admitted. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be," Frank said. "Most people do until they don't have a choice but to find out different. That's all right. What matters is what you do once you know better." Amanda looked out at the sea of leather and chrome, at faces that had once represented everything she feared, and now represented the closest thing to family she had left in the world, and understood finally the lesson that Highway had taught her. The loudest engines didn't always belong to the most dangerous people, and sometimes the family you needed most was the one you least expected to find. Grace stirred against her chest, and Amanda pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, grateful in ways she was still learning to put into words for the strangers who had stopped.